I want you to close your eyes for just a moment. Take a deep breath and try to remember the exact smell of the crisp, freezing winter air from your childhood. Can you smell the faint trace of sulfur from a spent firecracker lingering in the snow? Can you smell the sweet, caramelized smoke of roasted sweet potatoes rising from an old iron drum on the corner of a gray street? Welcome back to the winters of 1960s and 70s China. Today, we are going to embark on a quiet, emotional journey to remember 20 magical winter traditions that have completely vanished from our modern lives. We will walk down those snowy alleyways of our memory, rediscovering the simple rituals that kept us warm when the world was bitterly cold. And I promise you, when we reach the final memory, the image of a heavy black bicycle and simple brown paper packages, you will feel a warmth in your chest that you have not felt in decades. Let us begin our journey home. Time flowed very differently back then. It moved slower, with a quiet, deliberate rhythm that modern life has completely forgotten. Winter was not just a season to be endured indoors with central heating and digital screens. It was a profound, physical experience, a season of preparation, of waiting, and of deep human connection. Today, people often look back at the 1960s and 70s and assume that because we lacked money and modern technology, we lived impoverished lives. But they are entirely wrong. Our emotional lives were infinitely richer. Because we did not have much, we had to rely on each other. The biting cold forced us to gather around small coal stoves, to share stories, to make things by hand, and to find joy in the absolute simplest of pleasures. Every single object had value, and every winter chore was a family ritual. We are not just mourning the loss of old objects today, we are mourning the loss of that incredible intimacy, that beautiful sincerity that thrived in the freezing winters of our youth. Let us start by remembering the great winter ritual of storing the Chinese cabbage. In the late autumn, just before the first frost hit, the streets would fill with the sound of horse-drawn carts, heavily laden with mountains of green and white cabbage. The air smelled of damp earth and fresh leaves. This was not merely grocery shopping, it was a matter of survival, a family mobilization. Everyone, from the youngest child to the oldest grandfather, helped to carry the heavy cabbages into the courtyard or onto the narrow balcony. We would lay them out in the pale winter sun to dry the outer leaves, turning them carefully so they would not rot. Then came the meticulous process of stacking them against the brick walls, building a green fortress against the coming winter. We would cover them with old, heavy cotton quilts or thick plastic sheets to protect them from the deep freeze. Walking past those cabbage walls every day gave us a profound sense of security. The rhythmic crunch of chopping that cabbage for dumplings or stew would become the soundtrack of our winter. Today you can buy any vegetable at any time of the year, but the deep, comforting satisfaction of seeing that wall of winter cabbage is a feeling that has been lost forever. And now let us recall the sharp, metallic scent of coal dust that defined the winter atmosphere. The honeycomb coal briquettes were the literal lifeblood of every household. I remember watching people making them in the alleys, taking wet coal dust and pressing it into heavy wooden molds. The rhythmic, echoing thud of the mold hitting the frozen ground was the heartbeat of the neighborhood. We would carefully stack those damp black cylinders in the sun to dry, our hands stained black with the soot. But the true magic happened inside the house. The small cast-iron stove sat in the very center of the room, radiating a gentle, steady heat. Keeping that fire alive was an art form. You had to align the holes of the new briquette perfectly with the burning one beneath it, using heavy iron tongs. In the dead of a freezing night, the only light in the room would be the soft, glowing orange circles shining through the holes of the stove. Families would gather tightly around this small source of warmth, roasting peanuts on the metal lid, sharing stories, and feeling entirely safe while the wind howled outside. That small stove was the center of our universe. Do you remember walking home from school when the sky turned a dark, bruised purple and the wind bit into your cheeks? Then, cutting through the frosty air, came the most intoxicating aroma in the world, the smell of roasting sweet potatoes. The vendor would stand, bundled up in thick cotton layers next to a rusted, repurposed oil drum. The glowing charcoal at the bottom baked the sweet potatoes to absolute perfection. You would hand over a few carefully saved coins, and the vendor would fish out a steaming, blackened potato, wrapping it in a piece of rough scrap paper. The sheer warmth of it in your freezing, bare hands was a comfort words cannot describe. You would gently peel back the charred, papery skin to reveal the golden, piping hot flesh inside. The first bite was incredibly sweet, tasting of smoke, caramel, and pure winter magic. We would eat them slowly, letting the steam warm our faces, savoring every single bite because it was a rare luxury. Modern ovens can bake sweet potatoes perfectly, but they can never replicate the profound comfort of holding that hot, soot-stained potato on a freezing street corner in the 1970s. Let us turn our memories to the frozen rivers and lakes, like the vast expanse of Shichahai, or just the small pond at the edge of the village. Winter transformed these waters into our greatest playground. We did not have fancy imported ice skates or professional gear. Our skates were heavy, homemade contraptions. Fathers would take thick wooden boards and attach sharpened iron blades to the bottom, tying them to our thick cotton shoes with rough hemp ropes. The sound of dozens of metal blades scraping against the hard, white ice created a beautiful, chaotic symphony. For the younger children, fathers would build wooden sleds, sometimes just an overturned wooden chair with metal wire wrapped around the legs. We would sit on those chairs, bundled up like little stuffed bears, while our parents pushed us across the ice. The biting wind whipped our faces, our cheeks turned bright red, and our breath plumed like white smoke. But we never felt the cold. The sheer exhilaration of gliding across the frozen world, surrounded by the laughter of friends and neighbors, was the ultimate freedom of our childhood winters. Now let us think about the incredible weight and warmth of our winter clothes. In those days, we did not have thin, lightweight synthetic down jackets. We wore thick, heavy cotton padded jackets made entirely by hand. I can still picture my mother or grandmother sitting under the dim yellow light of a single bulb, meticulously sewing the fabric. The most magical part was watching them fluff the raw cotton. They would use a special bow to beat the old cotton, making it soft and airy again. It smelled faintly of sunlight and clean dust. When you first put on a freshly made cotton jacket, it was stiff and incredibly bulky. You could barely bend your arms, walking around like a little round snowman. But the warmth it provided was unparalleled. It was a heavy, comforting weight, like being wrapped in a constant, loving hug from your mother. We would wear those jackets every single day, the fabric slowly softening and molding to our bodies. Over the years, the cuffs would fray, and patches would be sewn over the elbows, but we wore them with pride, because every stitch was woven with a mother's deep, quiet love. What was the most beautiful color of winter? It was undeniably the brilliant, sparkling crimson red of the candied hawthorn sticks, the tanghulu. Against the endless gray skies and the white snow, that bright red was a shock of pure joy to the eyes. We would hear the vendor calling out long before we saw him, carrying a long wooden pole wrapped in straw, pierced with dozens of those gleaming red skewers. The smell of the melted, caramelized sugar was sharp and sweet. Buying a stick was a momentous occasion. You would hold it carefully, admiring the clear, glass-like shell of sugar coating the round, red berries. Then came the first bite, the loud, satisfying crunch as your teeth shattered the thin sugar ice, immediately followed by the tart, sour burst of the soft hawthorn berry inside. The contrast between the intense sweetness and the sharp sourness made our mouths water. It was a humble street snack, costing only a few cents. But to a child in the 1960s or 70s, it was the taste of happiness itself. A brief, beautiful moment of luxury in a harsh season. Let us remember the mornings before glass windows were common in every home. Our windows were made of delicate wooden lattices covered with thick, white paper. The winter wind would rattle those wooden frames all night long. But the true magic happened when you woke up in the freezing room, the tip of your nose completely numb. You would look over at the paper window and see that overnight, the cold had painted breathtakingly beautiful ice ferns across the surface. The intricate patterns of frost looked like silver forests, delicate flowers, and creeping vines. We would lie in bed, wrapped tightly in our heavy quilts, just staring at the frost. And then we would crawl out of bed, shivering, and press our warm fingers against the frost to melt a tiny spot. Or we would blow our warm breath gently against the paper until a small, clear peephole melted through the ice. Through that tiny, wet circle, we could spy on the outside world, watching the fresh, undisturbed snow blanketing the courtyard. Those paper windows were fragile, but the frost flowers they grew were the most beautiful winter art we ever knew. There was a very specific smell that told us the Lunar New Year was rapidly approaching. It was the sharp, pungent aroma of laba garlic. On the 8th day of the 12th lunar month, the Laba festival, every household would begin this sacred ritual. We children would sit at the table, our fingers sticky and smelling strongly of garlic, peeling hundreds of small cloves. We would drop the perfectly white cloves into a clear glass jar and fill it to the brim with dark, fragrant rice vinegar. Then the jar was sealed and placed on the cold window sill. Every day, we would run to the window to check on its progress. Slowly, magically, the stark white garlic would begin to turn green. It started as a pale tint, and over the weeks, it transformed into a brilliant, translucent jade green color. When the new year finally arrived and the jar was opened, the smell of that rich, garlicky vinegar would fill the whole house. Eating those crisp, emerald green cloves with hot dumplings was the defining taste of the winter holidays. It taught us the beautiful virtue of patience, showing us that the best things in life require time to perfect. Another unforgettable taste of the freezing months was the frozen persimmon. In late autumn, families would buy large quantities of hard, bright orange persimmons. Instead of keeping them warm, we would deliberately store them outside on the windowsill or the roof, letting the brutal winter frost freeze them as solid as rocks. They would sit there under the snow, glowing like little orange lanterns. When a special occasion arose, or when guests came to visit, my mother would bring a few of these frozen stones inside. She would place them in a basin of cold well water to slowly thaw. A beautiful, thin shell of clear ice would form entirely around the fruit. When they were slightly softened but still icy inside, we would carefully peel back the thin skin. We used a small spoon to scoop out the sweet, semi-frozen, jelly-like flesh. It was intensely sweet, cold, and utterly refreshing after a heavy winter meal. Long before we ever tasted factory-made ice cream, those frozen persimmons were our ultimate winter dessert, a miracle of nature that turned the bitter cold into something incredibly sweet. Let us recall the deafening, thrilling sounds of the winter holidays, the sharp cracking explosions of firecrackers echoing through the narrow alleyways. Back then, firecrackers were small, wrapped in tightly rolled red paper, smelling strongly of sulfur and gunpowder. As children, we were incredibly brave and slightly reckless. We would light a thin stick of incense, the tip glowing red in the gray afternoon. With shivering hands, we would touch the incense to the tiny fuse of a firecracker and throw it as far as we could into a deep snowbank. The muffled, heavy pop would send a spray of white snow and red paper flying into the air. We did not light them all at once. We would unbraid the string and set them off one by one, making the joy last for hours. By the time the sun set, the pristine white snow in the courtyard was completely covered in a beautiful, chaotic blanket of shredded red paper scraps. It looked like thousands of crimson flower petals scattered across the winter ground. The lingering smell of that gunpowder smoke was the very scent of celebration, warding off the cold and the evil spirits of the old year. Nothing brought a family closer together than the ritual of making winter dumplings. It was never a one-person job. It required the hands of every generation. The ritual began with the rhythmic, musical sound of heavy iron cleavers violently chopping fatty pork and fresh winter cabbage on a thick, scarred wooden block. The sharp, savory smell of soy sauce, minced ginger, and dark sesame oil filled the small kitchen. The grandfather would usually be in charge of kneading the dough until it was perfectly smooth and elastic. Then came the wrapping. Everyone sat around the table, their hands coated in white flour, chatting, laughing, and sharing stories of the past year. But the greatest excitement was the secret tradition of the hidden coin. My mother would take one single small metal coin, wash it perfectly clean, and fold it inside just one dumpling. We would all eat our bowls of steaming dumplings with bated breath, chewing carefully, hoping to hear that metallic clink against our teeth. The person who found the coin was promised good luck and prosperity for the entire year. It was a simple game, but it brought immense joy and hope to our winter nights. As the new year approached, the visual landscape of our homes transformed through the writing of the spring festival couplets. We did not buy pre-printed, shiny paper from a supermarket. It was a deeply personal, artistic endeavor. I remember watching the village scholar, or my grandfather, preparing the tools. He would pour a little water onto a heavy stone inkwell and slowly, rhythmically grind the solid black ink stick. The smell of that fresh ink was earthy, deep, and profound. Long strips of bright crimson paper were laid out across a large wooden table. With a soft brush made of animal hair, he would write bold, sweeping characters, asking for peace, health, and a good harvest. The black ink looked incredibly stark and beautiful against the vibrant red paper. We children would be given the task of making the paste, boiling flour and water on the coal stove until it was thick and sticky. We would brush the warm paste onto the wooden door frames and carefully press the couplets into place. Those bold red banners stood bravely against the howling winter wind, a declaration of hope and resilience for the year to come. When the sun went down, the cold inside the house became a physical presence. The bedrooms, far from the coal stove, were freezing. This is when the ritual of the hot water bottle became our greatest comfort. Some families had heavy, round brass warmers, beautifully engraved, but heavy as a brick. Others had the thick, ribbed rubber bottles that smelled strongly of hot rubber. The ritual was always the same. My mother would boil water on the stove and carefully pour it from a large thermos into the bottle, tightening the metal stopper securely. Because it was too hot to touch directly, she would wrap it in a piece of soft flannel or an old towel. Then she would slide it deep under the heavy cotton quilts, right down to the foot of the bed. Crawling into that freezing bed was a shock, but when your icy toes finally found that glowing core of heat buried in the blankets, the feeling of relief was absolutely intoxicating. That small, heavy source of warmth would slowly radiate through the entire bed, gently lulling us to sleep, while the icy wind rattled the paper windows. Bathing in the winter was not a daily routine. It was a grand, weekly expedition. We would pack a small bag with rough towels, a bar of harsh yellow soap, and clean clothes, and walk to the public bathhouse. Stepping through the heavy cotton curtains over the door was like entering a different world. The transition from the freezing street to the intensely hot, humid air took your breath away. The enormous room was filled with incredibly thick, white steam, making it hard to see the person next to you. The air echoed with the loud sounds of splashing water, the slap of wet towels, and the booming voices of neighbors loudly discussing politics or family matters. The scrubbing was intense, turning our skin bright red. But when we finally stepped out of the water, we felt miraculously light and entirely cleansed of the winter grime. The best part came afterward. Sitting in the changing room, our bodies radiating heat, sipping a cup of steaming hot jasmine tea from a cracked porcelain cup. The camaraderie, the shared warmth, and the simple luxury of hot water made the public bathhouse a sanctuary in the heart of winter. There was one anticipation that kept every child awake on the freezing nights before the new year: the promise of new clothes. In those days, clothing was strictly rationed. Getting a new outfit was a major life event. Mothers would carefully save their fabric coupons for months, finally buying a length of sturdy corduroy or dark blue cotton. For weeks, the sewing machine would hum late into the night. We would try on the half-finished garments, the pins scratching our skin, smelling the distinct scent of raw, unwashed fabric. On New Year's Eve, the finished clothes were meticulously folded and hidden underneath our pillows. We would lie awake in the dark, slipping our hands under the pillow just to feel the crisp texture of the new cloth, unable to sleep from sheer excitement. When the morning finally broke, we would dress in our stiff, brightly colored new clothes, feeling like entirely new people. We would walk out into the snowy courtyard with our chests puffed out, incredibly proud. We did not have closets full of fashion, but the joy that one single new jacket brought us was deeper than any modern luxury. Let us remember the final celebration of the winter season, the Lantern Festival, and the joyous, messy process of making yuanxiao. Today, people just buy frozen packets of sweet rice balls from the store, perfectly round and entirely devoid of soul. But back then, making them was a performance. We did not just wrap them, we rolled them. Grandmothers would take small, hard cubes of sweet filling made from crushed peanuts, black sesame, and sugar, and dip them in water. Then, they would drop them into a massive, flat bamboo basket filled with stark white, powdery, glutinous rice flour. The ritual required strength and rhythm. They would shake the heavy basket in wide, sweeping circles. The small cubes would bounce and roll through the snow-white powder, gradually gathering layers of dough, growing rounder and larger with every toss. The flour would fly into the air, covering our hair and eyelashes like fresh snow. When we finally boiled them, the water turned thick and milky. Biting into that soft, sticky dough to release the molten, sweet black sesame inside was the perfect, warm conclusion to the long winter holidays. Even in the dead of winter, the arrival of the mobile projectionist was an event no one would miss. Imagine standing in a freezing open field or the village square, the temperature well below freezing. A large, stark white sheet was tightly tied between two bare trees. The projectionist would set up his heavy equipment, the loud mechanical hum of the projector cutting through the silent night. Suddenly, a bright, powerful beam of light would pierce through the falling snow, illuminating the canvas. We would stand there for over 2 hours, wrapped in our heavy cotton jackets, our hands tucked deep into our opposite sleeves to conserve heat. We had to constantly stomp our feet in our heavy cloth shoes, just to keep the blood circulating. Our breath created clouds of steam in front of the screen, yet no one left. We were entirely mesmerized by the flickering black and white images of heroes and distant lands. The cold was agonizing, but the shared magic of standing shoulder to shoulder with the entire village, captivated by a single beam of light, warmed our spirits in a way television never could. In those years, absolutely nothing was ever wasted, especially not warmth. Let us recall the tedious but beautiful process of unraveling and knitting sweaters. When a wool sweater became too small, or the elbows wore completely through, it was not thrown away. My mother would carefully find the end of the yarn and begin to pull. She would make me sit facing her, holding my arms out stiffly, while she wound the crinkly, used yarn around my cold hands, rolling it into a tight, hard ball. It was a lesson in stillness and patience. Then, under the dim light bulb, I would listen to the rhythmic, metallic clicking of her bamboo knitting needles. She would take that old curly yarn, perhaps mixing it with a new color if we were lucky, and magically transform it into a brand new sweater for a younger sibling. The new sweater always looked a bit uneven, the yarn bearing the memory of its previous life. But putting it on was like wearing the physical manifestation of a mother's endless resourcefulness and care. It was a continuous cycle of warmth, passed down from child to child. As we walked the bustling winter streets, there was a sound and a smell that perfectly captured the essence of the season. The iron walk roasted chestnuts. You could hear it from a block away, the loud, harsh scraping sound of a giant iron shovel turning heavy black sand inside an enormous wok. The vendor would throw rough sugar into the scorching hot sand, where it would melt and coat the chestnuts. The air grew thick with a smoky, caramelized, deeply nutty aroma that made you instantly hungry. We would gather around the stove just to absorb the radiating heat. Buying a small brown paper bag of chestnuts was a tactile experience. The bag was searingly hot. The shells were dark brown, glossy and sticky from the burnt sugar. You had to crack the hard shell with your teeth or your freezing thumbs, burning your fingers slightly as you peeled it back. But the reward inside was a golden, steaming, perfectly tender nut that tasted like absolute heaven. It was not just a snack. It was a way to hold a handful of fire and sweetness against the bitter chill of the world. And finally, let us remember the most profound winter ritual of all, the journey to visit our relatives for the new year. There were no comfortable, heated cars. My father would bring out his heavy black bicycle, the metal frame freezing to the touch. I would sit on the cold metal rack over the back wheel, my hands tightly gripping his thick winter coat. The journey often took hours. The biting winter wind would sting my face and make my eyes water, but I hid behind his broad back, feeling entirely protected. Hanging from the handlebars were our simple gifts, usually just boxes of basic pastries wrapped in rough brown paper, tied meticulously with thin hemp string. By the time we arrived, our hands and feet were entirely numb, our eyebrows frosted white. But then the heavy wooden door would open, the rush of warm air from the coal stove, the loud joyful shouts of aunts and uncles, the rough warm hands pulling us inside, and the immediate offering of hot tea. That contrast between the brutal freezing journey and the overwhelming warmth of family love at the end of the road was the true definition of winter in our youth. When we look back at these 20 memories, we realize a profound truth. We do not just miss the taste of the frozen persimmons, or the smell of the coal stoves, or the heavy cotton jackets. What we truly miss is the way those things made us feel. We miss the slow pace of time. We miss the absolute necessity of leaning on each other to survive the cold. We miss the feeling of youth when a few pieces of candy or a perfectly built snowman could bring us entirely uncorrupted joy. Our lives were physically cold, but emotionally, we have never been warmer. If this quiet journey through our shared past has brought a tear to your eye or a smile to your face, please subscribe to our channel and like this video, so we can continue to preserve the history of our generation. Now, I want to ask you a very important question. Which of these winter traditions do you miss the absolute most? Or is there a special winter memory from your childhood that I missed? Please, write your story in the comments below. Let us build a warm fire of memories together. Thank you for walking down this snowy path with me.